Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on stage and tell you some stories about mobile networks, mobile network security. It is a long journey. We started about 9 years ago with the first radio intercept attacks, then discovering other IMSI catcher threats, and then SS7 finally in 2014. Since then, I think no major issue, no major vulnerability was discovered or published. And in these years, we continue to do research and analyze the new technologies that have been deployed around mobile networks. And today we are going to see a new one that was supposed to fix some of the issues of the previous technologies. And well, the outcome is that this technology probably did not yet reach that goal. So what happened? These days, really, about 1 week ago, Google started pushing very hard, together with other mobile operators worldwide, a new technology on your mobiles. This technology is called RCS, and it's going to replace and enhance your messaging and calling experience with mobiles. This is something similar to WhatsApp, iMessage, or Skype. It's just going to be integrated in your phones by default, so you don't need to install any other application. It will be there. And now the question, will this technology solve all those issues that I mentioned, intercepting over the radio, SS7 issues, and so on? Well, not yet. Okay? And today we will see quite a bunch of vulnerabilities we found, and also we will see what are the possible mitigations for those vulnerabilities. Let's start giving a bit of a recap of all these vulnerabilities that I talked about, and be basically aligned to what we defined as intercept, for example, or tracking users. Okay, so we grouped all these vulnerabilities into 5 areas. You see them there. The first is intercept. It's pretty easy to understand. It's just basically being able to intercept calls or SMS or even data. It can be done locally, so close to the victim, or remotely, for example, using SS7. So I, in a remote country, can sniff your calls and your SMS far away. Not only we can intercept calls and SMS, we can impersonate. This means I can start a new call on your behalf or send an SMS on your behalf. Pretty dangerous for certain use cases. And then what else? We can track users. This means locally or remotely, I can have an idea about who is around me, and I can track them quite precisely wherever they move around the world. Then we follow with fraud. Pretty interesting for mobile operators especially. Fraud means use a service without paying for the service, or use a service and charge somebody else for the service, and you get the revenue out of it. And finally, DOS. This is something we don't see very commonly in the wild, but it's possible to create a DOS for a single user. So I could make your mobile unreachable, or I could make the whole network unreachable. So this was just a recap of the 5 attack possibilities we see in mobile networks. Now, let's see where these attacks or where these issues are. Mobile networks are composed of many boxes, and some of them have been analyzed pretty well by security researchers, starting from the mobile, the radio channel, and SS7, as I mentioned, diameter on this side. But in the middle of this diagram, there are plenty of boxes that have not been fully analyzed. And especially this one in the middle, IMS, has been covered by some research, but not really deeply analyzed. And that's where we are going today. Not only IMS, but also RCS, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Okay, so this might be new to you, so I'm going to explain why do we have these IMS and RCS technologies. Mobiles were thought for mobile communication, so calls, and later for SMS. So this was the 2nd and 3rd generation of mobiles. Then later, in the 4th generation, the key became the internet. So internet was added to the mobile, and that became the major use of your mobile. So you normally communicate over IP when you use your mobile. And in fact, between the second generation and third generation and the fourth, the difference is that in the fourth, the voice channels that were previously used just for voice now disappeared. So when you make a call over 4G, that call goes over IP, or has to go over 3G. Interesting, because now many of you are familiar with the IP technology, can look into that, and can see if there are any vulnerabilities. But not only over IP, now we see a new extension to that. So calls over IP were 4G. Now we extended that to support group chats, sending files, video calling, and all the features that you are used to, as I said, with iMessage or WhatsApp or Skype. This technology existed for some years, but was not really pushed out until, as I said, recently by Google, this hard push. So every mobile from Google, so Android, will have this technology from Android 9, I think. It is going to be deployed. So actually, most of you already have it on your phone, and you don't even notice you have it. We will see what happens later when we try to use messages and so what are the possible issues with that? And you might ask, okay, but you are talking about a technology that we don't know, so how popular is that technology? We tried to measure that. We took a list of mobile operators provided by the GSMA, the Association of All Mobile Operators, about 900 networks, and we tried to see how many of them deployed 4G, so LTE. About 1/3 of them do. And as I said, when you have 4G, the only way to carry calls over 4G is to do it over IP. So there are two possibilities for carrying calls over IP. One is directly on LTE, and the other is over Wi-Fi. So we measured this via DNS queries. We abuse, let's say, the structure, the particularly structured way of indexing the nodes in the telco network. And with this survey, we evaluated about 200 deployments support this technology, VoLTE, and 150 support voice over Wi-Fi. That is an extension to it. Now, as I said at the beginning, we are interested in RCS. This is an extension to everything. And we tried to measure this, and our numbers are about 100 networks worldwide support this technology already, but consider these numbers are lower bound numbers because we cannot really estimate in each country how many networks do support RCS because they block the access to their DNS server. But anyway, so consider about 100 networks, and you want to say, okay, 100 networks where? So here is the map. As you can see, most developed countries have this technology already. The color on the map meaning at least one network in that country has RCS on. In some countries, most of the operators have it. For example, in the US, all operators support RCS already. In Europe, there are also big groups like Orange, Vodafone, that's already supported. And some countries are currently running trials, so this technology is really being pushed out. Okay. This was the intro to the technology, to see what is the coverage of this technology. Now we jump into our results. Well, as I said, we hoped that this technology would solve several problems, but did it? Did it solve the problems? No. Every category that we listed before, those 5 areas of attacks, we found for each of them at least one attack vector that worked. I have to say not all networks are vulnerable to the same vulnerabilities, but at least one network is vulnerable to what we say today. And we will see there is one particular attack on the intercept side that applies to basically all networks. We could not measure it, but we think it applies to all networks. So what could we do? Yeah, tracking users, impersonation, fraud, and finally, intercept calls. I have to say also, the first 4 of these attacks do not require additional information to be carried on. So if I want to do call impersonation, so if I want to call a person spoofing the caller ID, I don't need any particular new information. I can just connect to the network, spoof the caller ID, and it works. While for the last attack category, we need something more. So to intercept calls, we need either a configuration file that is deployed on the mobile of our victim, or we need to set up a special man-in-the-middle attack with some DNS and domain craftery. OK, so I will now leave the stage to Sina that will explain in detail all of these attacks and then come back with the mitigations.
Thanks, Luca. So let's start with user tracking. We could find different attack vectors to track users by abusing RCS functionalities. The fact is that both RCS and IMS uses SIP protocol as their signaling protocol. And there's a feature in that protocol that party can see if other user is available or not. That can happen by sending a SIP option packet. And if the user is available, the response to that request would be a SIP 200 OK. Otherwise, network will reply to your request and says, user not found. So what the attacker can do here is to prepare a list of numbers that he wants to enumerate, send SIP options packet to the RCS core for each of those numbers, and collect the responses. If the user is available, attacker will receive as 200 OK, including some information about user. Since all operators have an interconnect for RCS and IMS, this attack can be scaled to international numbers and different operators. So the attacker will be able to even enumerate users in different countries and different operators. The SIP 200 message, coming back to the attacker, would include the user's IP address, device model, and different information. Based on that IP address, attacker will be able to roughly locate the location of victim based on the IP geolocation databases, especially if that IP address is IPv6, since recently all mobile operators are moving to IPv6. We have found another attack vectors to find user location. I'm going to elaborate on that later in this presentation. But for now, let's move on to impersonation and fraud attack. There is a really well-known and old attack in SIP protocol that an attacker is able to craft caller ID. This happened by crafting a SIP invite message and changing the caller ID. When we were working on this research, we didn't expect that old vulnerability still exists in this new technology. But surprisingly, we could find different networks vulnerable to this attack vector. How this happened? First, the attacker needs to connect to the network by his own credentials through SIP register. After establishing the connection, he can craft a message, a SIP invite message, and send to another party. SIP invite is used to establish a call or sending a message. And in that message, attacker will be able to change the caller ID, set any other numbers, for example, premium numbers, or a number which is expensive to be called. So he can cause the victim to be charged more money, or attacker would be able to earn money by making a missed call, changing the caller ID to a premium number owned by the attacker. So if the victim is curious enough, he would call back, and attacker would be able to earn money by receiving that call. Besides of that, this traditional and old vulnerability in SIP, we could find new attack vectors in RCS. The fact is that some RCS cores can recognize their users only based on the public IP address and the username. Username usually is the phone number of the user. So if the attacker and the victim both uses the same public IP address, could be through the VPN connections or a Wi-Fi NAT, the RCS core would not be able to recognize if the request is coming from the legit user or an attacker or someone else. In that case, an attacker will be able to craft SIP messages sent to the RCS core. Since they have attacker and victim are using the same public IP address, RCS core cannot recognize if that's a legit request or not, and will accept the connection. So let's go through this attack by watching a video. Here we have a hotspot ran by attacker, and we monitor our victim and victim friends' devices to see messages between them. Okay, victim looks for probably free internet connection, connects to the hotspot ran by attacker, and immediately after connecting to the internet, RCS client tries to connect to the RCS core by retrieving first PCSCF connection, IP address, and then establishing the connection. Okay, as we see here, connection goes over TLS. Unfortunately, we cannot intercept that. We cannot see what's going on. But here we can see to which PCSCF the client is connected and what port number. Okay, next step, finding the IP address and port number. Here we have it. And we also developed a tool that receives sender phone number, receiver phone number. Also, it needs the PCSCF IP address and port number. And we could set an arbitrary message that will be sent to another party. So our tool can actually craft a SIP invite and send it to the RCS core. And as we see here, since attacker and victim both are using the same public IP address, RCS core couldn't recognize that packet is coming from an attacker and it's not a legit request. So RCS core accepted our request and delivered the message to another party without even notifying the real user that you are sending something. Okay, let's move on. We saw fraud, impersonation, and one attack vector for tracking user, but we also explored different functionalities in RCS. There is another functionality in RCS, as Luca already mentioned, to transfer media files like WhatsApp, iMessage, and other messenger applications that you can send video, picture, video calls, and stuff like that. And the way this feature works in RCS is that the RCS client first uploads that file, for example, image, to a file transfer server. The FT server replies with an XML confirmation, including two different URLs in that XML confirmation. One is thumbnail URL, and the second URL points to the actual file uploaded to the FT server. RCS client sends that XML confirmation to the receiver, and once the receiver gets that XML data, the RCS client automatically starts downloading the thumbnail URL without asking the user. So here, in this case, an attacker will be able to just craft an XML confirmation, put the URL of the thumbnail pointing to a large file hosted on a target website, and send that XML confirmation to a large number of users. Once those users receives that XML confirmation, RCS client automatically, without asking the user, tries to download the thumbnail, and it can cause a DDoS attack against that target website. Also, the thumbnail URL can point to a server under control of the attacker, so once the receiver gets that XML confirmation data, tries to again make an HTTP request to that server and reveal some information about the victim, such as IP address, such as device model, that can make attacker able to track the user location. Also, what we found super interesting, we found some specific implementation of RCS client that attach really sensitive information to the HTTP request. Those specific clients attach a session token as a HTTP header to the HTTP request to the thumbnail URL and tries to download the file. So if attacker crafts the URL and have his own server, attacker will be able to collect session tokens, and session token makes the attacker able to take over the victim's account completely. Okay, let's explore other attack vectors here. The more interesting one, interception. We could find 3 different attack scenarios to intercept text messages through RCS. The first one is via abusing XCAP weaknesses. XCAP is an interface that's in RCS, which is used to set call forwardings. We could set call forwardings for a victim and receives the victim's calls, the same as what we could do with SS7 protocol. I'm not going to elaborate on this attack scenario in this presentation, but we are going to focus more on the last 2 scenarios. The second scenario is to abuse RCS provisioning security issues. We could find 4 different ways for abusing the RCS provisioning. And the last one will be to do a DNS spoofing and doing a SIP man-in-the-middle attack. Let's start with RCS provisioning. Let's first see what RCS provisioning is and how it works. Provisioning means to configure the credentials on the user's device so the device would be able to connect to the network. The way it works in RCS is that RCS client first makes an HTTP request to the config server. In case the user is using LTE connection, the config server will use HTTP header enrichment and authenticate user based on his connection. Then config server replies, in that case, OTP verification might not be necessarily by operator. So the config server replies a session ID, and if a connection is over the Wi-Fi, also config server sends an OTP through a binary SMS. Once the user has both OTP and session ID, it will make another HTTPS request to the config server, including OTP and session ID. If all received information by config server is correct, the config server replies an XML file, provisioning file, including credentials and different parameters that client needs to use in order to connect to the RCS. So first ever attack scenario that we came up with was to having a malicious application on the target phone. In case there's a malicious application residing on your Android phone, it will be able to do the provisioning process by abusing your LTE connection to the network, retrieves the config file, and upload it to a server under control of the attacker. There might be a question, okay, what if we cannot make our victim to install the malicious application? It's not the case always. The second attack scenario that we came up with was to abusing the internet connection shared through a hotspot. Imagine the victim is sharing internet connection with an attacker, and attacker can make requests to the internet through the victim's LTE connection. So attacker will be able to do the provisioning process again, receive the session ID first, and then config file, and abuse the config file, as we see later how it would happen. Again, there might be a question, okay, it's not always the case that we can tamper the user to share the internet connection or maybe installing a malicious app. We also surprisingly found that is another way that we can use a fake access point. In this case, victims connect to the attacker access point, malicious JavaScript payload will be injected to the user's browser, and that JavaScript code will help attacker to retrieve the config file. It might sound a bit complicated, so let's go through this attack by watching a video demo. Okay, here on the right side, we see the victim's phone looking for free internet connection and a hotspot ran by attacker. Okay, our victim is looking for internet and in few seconds finds a free hotspot and connecting to the attacker's hotspot. After connecting to the hotspot, user starts browsing the internet or opening a website or whatever. And there we go. Attack is done. It happened quickly, so maybe you didn't realize what happened. Victim connected to the rogue access hotspot and started browsing the internet. The fake access point fetched the actual content that users were looking for, injected malicious JavaScript payload into that, and returned back to the users. Immediately after that, disconnected the user from the hotspot. So the phone falls back to the LTE connection. But the JavaScript payload is still running on the browser's engine. So, and also, what you can see here on the victim's device, the URL changed to a 3GPP network URL because we need to use the same context for that. That JavaScript fetched the session ID through the LTE connection and sends that session ID to the attacker server. So on the attacker server, he will be able to retrieve the actual config file. Now we have a config file on our server. I guess I reload the... Sorry. OK, now we have a config file on our server. Let's take a look and see what we can find in this config file here. Here on top, we see a token value, which is masked because it's a really critical value in this config file. By using that token value, attacker will be able to retrieve the config file later without need to do OTP verification, without need any access, just by using that token value. Also, we see the victim's phone number here. Other parameters, let's just scroll down here in the file. OK, here. We see a set of credentials here, which is used to connect to the RCS core by client. Once the attacker has these credentials, he will be able to do whatever on behalf of the victim. That means completely account takeover. Also, there is another set of credentials here, which can be used to upload media files to the file transfer server. Also, there are other parameters here for provisioning that client needs to have, but they aren't really interesting values for us. So coming back to our presentation, OK, all of those attacks might need tampering the victim, but there might be some possibility to do a fully remote attack. In case even OTP verification is needed, we surprisingly found some networks vulnerable to OTP brute force vulnerability. This attack can happen in two steps. At the first step, attacker would need to enumerate valid IMSIs by sending HTTP requests to the config server. And config server returns different values and HTTP status code based on the validity of IMSI. As we can see here on the top right, a screenshot, config server returned 200 OK for valid IMSIs and 403 for invalid IMSIs. Once the attacker has valid IMSIs, he can try to brute force OTP, and if the network doesn't apply rate limiting for OTP verification, attacker would be able to retrieve the XML config file by brute forcing the OTP. As you can see on another screenshot, that we could retrieve the config file by brute forcing those OTP. OK, we saw 4 different ways how to abuse RCS provisioning and retrieve the config file. Now we have the credentials, and it's time to do message interception. The way intercepting works is that the user is connected to the network either by LTE, legacy networks, or RCS, doesn't matter. The attacker, on the other hand, on the other side, uses the credentials that retrieved to connect to the RCS core. While the attacker is connecting to the RCS core, he makes sure that he sets SMS over IP value true. SMS over IP tells the RCS network that this instance is able to receive SMS messages over IP protocol. After connecting to the RCS core, attacker will wait for receiving an SMS. How it works, Once someone wants to send you an SMS, for example, your bank wants to send you an OTP, the SMS delivers to the SMSC. SMSC asks your home network where that message should go. Since there is an instance available that can receive SMS over IP, this message will be forwarded to IPSM gateway. In that node, the SMS packet will be converted to the IP packet and will be delivered to the attacker first via SIP message. Once the attacker receives this message, he can decide to acknowledge the message or not. If the attacker acknowledges the message, the network doesn't deliver the message to the actual user. Otherwise, the message will be delivered to the real users too. We were thinking of, okay, how we can abuse this security issue. The first scenario that came to our mind was to abusing the Google password recovery for Gmail and receive an OTP by exploiting this vulnerability. Let me show you how we exploit that vulnerability to take over a Gmail account. OK. Here, again, we see our victim's device, which is not related really to these attacks. But we see the attacker's laptop too. OK. Attacker starts the password recovery process by just selecting the Gmail account. Definitely, we don't know what password is. And we ask Google to send us a text message. We have developed a tool here that uses a victim's config file, connects to the RCS message, set SMS over IP flag true, and waits for incoming SIP messages. After connecting to the RCS core, we can ask Google, OK, please send us an OTP for verifying our identity. And we see after a few seconds that we can receive the message even before the actual user. There we go. We have the OTP here. And since we don't acknowledge the message, it will be also delivered to the actual user after a few seconds. We just wanted to monitor the victim's device to see that we are intercepting the correct OTP and message. By having this OTP, we could just proceed with the password recovery process, set a new password for that target Gmail account, as we see here, and completely taken over that Gmail account. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. OK. We also investigated more in RCS and also Android default messenger. And we found another interesting attack vector that comes from a wrong way of validating TLS certificates. What happens, once the client has the RCS config, it tries to find the IP address of PCSCF by querying the DNS. And after having the right address, tries to establish a TLS connection. The only thing that RCS client, actually the Android default messenger, does is to verify if that TLS certificate is valid or not. The client doesn't check if the certificate matches the domain based on the config file. So what an attacker is able to do here is to do a DNS spoofing, sends a fake answer to the SRV for PCSCF, and sets a domain under his own control, pointing to a server under his own control too. And this next step, the client tries to connect to that fake PCSCF, and the attacker replies to that TLS handshaking with a valid certificate. So the client trusts the connection and starts sending the SIP messages. On the other side, the fake PCSCF under control of the attacker is connected to the legit PCSCF. So attacker will be able to do a man-in-the-middle attack on SIP messages. He will be able to seize all SIP messages going on, and even he will be able to modify packages. We also worked on this issue more. We could develop some tool to exploit this vulnerability that I can show you via a demo here. OK. Here again, we see two Android devices, one our victim's friend, and a fake PCSCF with a SIP proxy running on that, on the attacker server. The victim tries to connect to a hotspot ran by attacker, and OK. Yeah. After connecting to the hotspot, again tries to find the PCSCF and connects to the RCS. Yeah. Here we see, in response to the SRV request to the sips.tcp, we replied with a domain under uncontrol, pcscf.srlabs.de. The client accepts that response and tries to establish TLS connection. Since we replied with a valid certificate issued to that domain, again, the client trusted our certificate and started negotiating the SIP messages. As we see here, we got SIP register, and we did a transparent proxy between the legit PCSCF and the client. Then, in this case, victims wanted to reply to an existing message. So our tool will be able to detect PayPal addresses and replace it with a fake one. So as we see here, we could catch a SIP invite message including a PayPal handler, and we replace that with our own PayPal handler and deliver the modified message to the victim's friend. And all connections went over the TLS, and without notifying anyone that something is going on in the middle. OK, let's get back to the next step.
So I don't know if this was surprising to you, but basically, we found a bunch of vulnerabilities that we did not expect to still find in modern systems. So all related to HTTP misconfigurations, SIP also misconfiguration or bad implementations, and all of these carry on these pretty critical attacks. So what can we do about it? We listed here 7 best practices that should be taken by mobile operators and vendors in order to fix those issues. And I will start by protecting those, the configuration file that Sina could retrieve pretty easily in 4 different ways. So how do you protect the provisioning? The standard specifies a more secure way of authenticating clients. So this is the one that we recommend, using the SIM card as a secure element to authenticate the user. It's called GBA. If the network, for any reason, does not support that feature, because the vendor does not support it, there is, of course, the option to turn on OTP. We saw that some networks don't do OTP currently, so definitely turn on OTP and make sure that your OTP is a pretty strong OTP, so let's say 8 characters, alphanumeric. And then, in conjunction with those measures, make sure that you apply rate limiting on those requests. So whenever you have a possibility to brute force something, make sure that you slow down the attacker. For example, allowing only 3 attempts for the OTP, or saying this OTP is only valid for 5 minutes, and that way it should be very hard to brute force it. This was to protect the RCS configuration file, but there are also some issues that are affecting the network side, so the actual core. For that, there are other 3 measures. We want to validate the client identity. We saw that the network was only identifying clients by the external IP. This is not possible. There should be some other more strict way to do that, for example, using the 4 tuples, so source IP, source port, destination IP and port, and maybe also the socket ID, to verify that the client is connected, and after the identity is verified, no other client can connect and spoof the same identity. We saw that there were some information that were leaked in these messages. There is clearly some way to protect against this attack. So the SBC, that is the border gateway of the network, should mask all these values that come from the users towards other users. So, for example, the IP or the model or some other information that clients are sending to the network. And finally, the file uploads. We saw that because you could specify a foreign domain, you could trigger a client to download something from an external source. Well, the standard says that that domain should follow a specific pattern, and these clients did not implement that check. So make sure that the files that are shared between users match that specific domain, so no external domains can be used, and also try to validate the content type and size of the file before you deliver the XML on the other side. And then the very last issue we presented, that's a combination of certificate validation and DNS mistrust. We cannot fix the DNS because we know today we cannot do that, but we can enforce that the domain specified in the configuration file has to match the one in the certificate from the server. And this can be done, and this involves some to-do list for the vendors, or for Google, and for the operators. We are in contact with both. We communicated this issue, and they are currently working on it. Okay, these are the best practices that should be adopted by mobile operators and vendors. And if everyone does his job correctly, we will have actually a secure RCS, a new technology that is actually secure. Okay, so closing the presentation, as security researchers, we are always interested in new technologies. We were surprised by all the issues we found in this technology. And actually, there is probably a reason behind it. The reason is that it's all over IP, right? So everyone now can have a look into these protocols and find vulnerabilities. And the other thing that I think is behind this issue is that there are new vendors that came into the market because it's very easy to create a web application, let's say. So many new vendors came into the market. And those vendors are probably not having that experience with security like the old ones. And that means, well, they introduce new vulnerabilities. So I will encourage all the security research community to investigate every new technology that comes out, and let's fix it before it's too late. In this case, it's currently too late. This technology has been deployed, and it's already broken. Well, I know that mobile operators and Google are really working hard to fix this. Maybe today even it's already fixed. I'm not sure about that. But definitely, let's keep testing, keep pushing the security best practices around. And just a final note, I want to thank all the security research labs team that work on this, and not only I and Sina work on this, so also Lucas Euler and Martin Saar. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening to our talk.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you for a great talk. If you don't have an application that can read the SMSs, is the only way to get the OTP from the binary SMS to brute force it?
So you're asking about when a network uses OTP and forces OTP for the client provisioning?
I think so.
Okay. So one option would be to have malware on your phone that has the permission to read SMS. Then it would be clear. The other way would be to brute force it. But as I said, that's possible in some networks because they don't implement rate limiting, but if you do it correctly, it's not possible.
Approximately how many networks implemented rate limiting?
I can say rather the other case. So we found 2 networks where this was possible. The length of the OTP was 5 and 6 digits, and yeah, it was not well protected.
Do they all enforce OTP authentication?
No. So probably you have seen the other scenarios where we can capture the RCS config without any OTP. So with a rogue hotspot in the middle, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for one of the attacks, you said that you need to brute force the IMC. So IMC is 60 bits. So how long it takes?
No, the IMSI is 15 digits, and the first 5 are defined by the mobile operator, and there are other 10.
Yeah.
So you can just randomly generate 10 digits, and there is a very high chance that you will find one that works because there are millions of users in the network. So it's pretty easy to find one that works. It might not be the one of your victim. But that's pretty hard, of course. But
Right. So how do you correlate? Like, this is your victim.
right. So there are plenty of other attacks, like IMSI catchers, for example. There is one attack that I didn't mention today that involves also IMS and RCS technology. Whenever your mobile connects to a hotspot, the mobile tries to connect to this voice over Wi-Fi technology, the EPDG, and when doing so, it discloses the IMSI. So I could be sure of your IMSI by doing that, for example.
So I have a next question. So do you think these attacks will be applicable to 5G?
Yes, so RCS and IMS are technologies that are carrying voice over IP, and they apply to 4G and 5G.
So in 5G, actually, IMZ is not exposed in plain text.
Yeah.
So in that case, what will be the...
So this is the theory. 5G will introduce encrypted IMSIs whenever networks do standalone deployments. But so far, the 5G networks that I've seen in the world are not standalone. That means your IMSI is still going unencrypted. And because of legacy, your mobile will still be able to send the unencrypted IMSI back to the network. So on 5G, not, but if you can force the user to connect to 4G, 3G, or 2G, you can still capture the IMSI.
Cool.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. On slide 14, when you transmit the, in step 3, the XML file.
Yes.
After delivering the file, will the content be executed or displayed, or is it just, passively delivered?
It's, of course, a good question. There is XML, and there are plenty of attacks around XML. I think we tried some of them, but we couldn't see any issue with that. So the only issue was the logical issue of the URL not being trustworthy. Yeah. It depends on the library, I have to say. So if it's Java, there is a low chance that something goes wrong. But if it's C, well. Okay. So thank you again, and make sure you update your phone soon.
Thank you.